Welcome to Before It Was Extreme. I'm joined here today by Jim Molyneux
How are you?
and Joel Goodhart.
I'm in the clouds. I'm in the clouds.
Yes, Joel's having some technical difficulties today. How's everybody doing?
Very well.
I'm in the clouds. I'm in the clouds. I'm doing fine without a video.
Today we are talking about Larry Winters. Now, both of you know Larry pretty well. So he's a Philadelphia-based professional wrestler. He's no longer with us, but I'm sure you guys have a ton of stories to cover this episode. So the first thing I found on Larry Winters was it looked like his career started in the Stampede territory. Does that sound right to you guys?
No.
Okay. Where did he start?
I think, well, he stayed on the East Coast, and I think when I got to know him, he was wrestling for the NWF. And he was doing independent shows on the East Coast against DC Drake. And that really, I think, for me anyway, started the history that I'm aware of Larry. How about you, Jim?
Yeah, I know he did something in Stampede, but I don't know the timeline, whether NWF was first and then went to Stampede or the other way around. But he did something in Stampede, and again, I don't know when or even how long he was there. But I know him before TWA through the NWF. They had some tapes at the time released, and he was on some of them, and of course the feud with Drake that went all over the East Coast.
So the stuff I found from Stampede is 1979. Him working a bunch of matches with Bruce Hart. There's even some stuff from IWF, which was Allentown. He teamed with Dominic DeNucci, took on the Valiant Brothers. I don't see anything for NWF until about 87. Does that sound right?
Well, it could be. You do a lot more history than me. I would be surprised if you went back to 1979. That being said, if you tell me you've got video of it or you've seen it, I'll accept that. Like I said, I hooked up with Larry, then obviously later in his career. The matches with the NWF, I also saw him at the TV taping with the AWA when he fought Larry Zbyszko. If he went back 8 years prior to that or 9 years prior to that, back to Stampede, like I said, good for you, but that was a history I wasn't aware of.
I mean, next you're going to tell me that Pat Patterson didn't win the Intercontinental title in Rio de Janeiro.
Well, but first of all title changes occurred in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Okay, that you learned very early on in your career that anytime they had to do a title match, that to change the title and they had to do it overnight, it was always in Albuquerque, New Mexico.
Really? I've never heard of that one before. That's good.
Yeah, I'm telling you, watch some of the old WWF tapes. And you know what? One of the things that the WWF back in the day talked about from the territory standpoint was, they wrestled basically in, if you go Boston to Philadelphia to Pittsburgh to Baltimore, that was basically their territory and all the towns in between. And of course, they wanted to say that they were worldwide. So, of course, they had matches in Albuquerque, New Mexico.
Sure. So after then, it looked like he worked a number of WWF and AWA tapings in the 80s, including working Nick Bockwinkel a number of times, as well as Larry Zbyszko. But let's talk about you guys. When did you both run into Larry Winters?
You go first, Joel, because you met him before me. So
yeah, I'm going to say it was the NWF days. For some reason, Brick, New Jersey, it just hits me because there was a TV taping for the NWF in Brick, New Jersey, and Abdul was on the card, and all the independent guys. And anyway, Larry Winters was there, and we had sponsors from the Squared Circle. We had sponsored a bus trip to Brick, New Jersey. So we had 45 or 50 people went to this TV taping. And I'm almost positive that's where I met Larry. And I found out Larry actually wanted to take the ride up on the bus with us because it was free transportation. He lived maybe he lived maybe
That's
five
Larry.
miles, yeah, 5 miles from me. And that's how we hooked up. And Larry wound up, and we'll talk about this, I'm sure, but wound up being my booker for the TWA. Larry also was a part owner along with myself and Ron Shaw in Ringmasters Wrestling School. And of course, he was one of the teachers at Ringmasters Wrestling School and wound up to become, a star, if you will, in the TWA. And being the booker, he ran some phenomenal angles. And of course, I got my relationship with DC Drake from Larry. So that's where it started for me. I believe it was from Brick, New Jersey, the NWF TV taping.
For me, it was a TWA show before I signed up to train as a referee. It was the one show at McGonigal Hall. And Joel, I don't know if there's video footage of any of the McGonigal Hall stuff.
There is.
But the match that he had with Drake, and I don't remember the stipulation, but if Ryan, if you can picture this, that they went through the building, the gymnasium, which was one level of bleachers on each side, and went to a walking level out to the concourse, but there was a press box up in the top of the building that somehow you got to. There were no steps inside the building to get to it, so it was somewhere outside in the concourse that you got to this press box, and they disappeared. And at the time, people didn't follow the match out in the hallway like they do now. All of a sudden, Larry is hanging out of the press box. Think of it as, hanging out of the second level of, the spectrum. That's how high up in the air he was. I can't remember if it was Pins Count Anywhere or if it was a dog collar match. They had tons of dog collar matches. That was their meal ticket when they would travel around the East Coast doing independents. We'll come in and we'll do a dog collar match. But that was the first time I saw Larry. And then, of course, as Joel mentioned, being a trainer with TWA, I learned to bump from Larry. I learned how to ref from John, but I learned how to bump from Larry.
Yeah, I'll actually grow on that a little bit. Jim, you missed one of the that match was great, but that was actually a follow-up. The first match that DC and Larry Winters did at Temple McGonigal Hall, where Jim Molyneux mentions the press box, forget that for a second. The way the building was set up, the ring was on the floor, the gymnasium floor. There were two sets of bleachers, as Jim mentioned. But from the bleachers, there was a walkway that was one story up. And there were people that would come in, buy a ticket, but then stand on the walkway. Well, anyway, Larry Winters and DC Drake, again, don't remember the stipulations, but wound up battling onto the walkway. And then you have to picture DC Drake and Larry Winters hanging from the walkway. And then in this one, DC Drake takes the bump off the walkway onto the gymnasium floor. Okay. And he fell 10 feet, literally 10 feet. He was hanging, but he fell 10 feet to the bleachers and the floor at the bottom. And that was the first time, okay, that anybody saw anything like that. So with the match that Jim's talking about was the following year, the following show, they had to top that. And one of the conversations we were having before the show is, how do you top being thrown off 10 feet onto the floor? Well, behind one set of bleachers, there was a set of steps that led to the press box. And the only people that got up to the press box, obviously, were people that were broadcasting because they could see all the way down. And that's about 2 stories up, okay, if you can picture. And so they decided the only way they could possibly top doing what they did the last show was to go up to the press. Anyway, they wrestled up to the press box. There was no way that we were going to let anybody go down 2 stories, 20 feet. Just no way we were going to do it. And if they would have done it for some crazy reason, they would have landed in the bleachers. So they won't even landed on flat floor. So there was no way. So they wrestled up there. We have a video camera. My videotape. So we do have it somewhere. The videographer went up to the steps along with Larry and DC, went into the press box, and you literally saw Larry Winters hanging out of the press box with his body, 1 foot hanging over. There was a bar that he was holding on to, and of course DC wanted to protect him a little bit, but Larry literally hung out over the press box. And most of the fans were down on the floor watching this. And it's things like that. Well, those things go unsung, but it was moves like the one that went over the floor on by DC, the second one with Larry Winters hanging over. Those are the things that put Tri-State on the map, because the Bob Smiths from PWI were there. George Napolitano, Bill Apter, and those photos got into magazines, and well, the rest is history.
And just to add on to it, I can remember when now I'd become a referee, and there was the show in it was a high school in Newark, Delaware, and I'm pretty sure it was Drake and Larry again, and I can remember Drake coming in, which this should be said in his topic, but we'll talk about it here because it involved Larry. That he walked in the building and he's looking around, going, "Oh, we can hang from there, or we can go up here and come through there." And it was one of those gyms that had a walkway, but on the one side it was where they kept all like gymnastics equipment and soccer balls and stuff like that. And oh, we could get in there. It was a cage. You're like, oh, if we can get in there, we can have a cage match too.
Now, the one thing that I think both Jim and I are talking about Larry in the same way. Larry Winters was a wrestler, but he was a person first. He understood the wrestling fan. He understood at least what the TWA fans were looking for, and prior to me, the NWF fans. And with him and DC Drake, you had a feud that they wrestled all over the East Coast. And my contention is there were people that actually bought tickets because these two guys were on the card wrestling each other. There was a magic about the two of them. There was again, the fans that followed the sport that were going to the independent shows. When you have an independent show, 95% of the people there have never been to a wrestling card. They went because it was local, et cetera, et cetera. The 5 to 10% that were there who followed the guys knew that match was going to be worth the price of admission.
So how did you involve Larry Winters in TWA? Was he there from the very first show, or was it something that was added later on?
No, I believe now, again, I wish I was a historian and actually spent the time when the first show that we did well, it wasn't a TWA show at the time, but the first show I did was at Neshaminy High School. I think I mentioned it one of the last shows that we did, where my main event was Dominic Ganucci and Mighty Igor. Now, I was a sellout of the building. But Dominic Ganucci obviously was tight with Larry Winters, and Larry was on the card. And because Larry was local and Larry lived in Philadelphia, that helped me in just growing the company. And, one of the things that I've always talked about, and at some point we probably can do a show about this, but I've was always a believer, as TWA was created, that the promoter promotes, the wrestlers wrestle. Okay. And I never liked to get involved in any of the angles. I didn't want to get involved in the matches. And Larry, on the other hand, was a wrestler who quite frankly never wanted to get into promotion. And Larry just wanted to get paid. Larry was in it for the money, and he recognized that, he's not going to make a living doing it, but he'll get paid by just giving people what they want. And so when Larry first was local and I was putting together the TWA, one way to keep a lot of the costs down from where I was coming from was the local guys. Because every wrestler that I wanted to bring in, Jerry Lawler, Terry Funk, Curry Von Erich, I mean, I can go down the list. You had to fly him in, you had to give him a hotel. It was expensive. And so Larry Winters, DC Drake was up in Connecticut. Larry Winters was local. Rockin' Rebel was local. Tony Stetson was South Philadelphia. Johnny Hotbody was South Philadelphia. I mean, I can go down this list. The local guys really made the show. They really did make the show. They didn't necessarily sell the tickets, but they made the show. And so that's how I got involved with Larry. He was local, and he was a booker by designation and definition. Larry Winters was the persona of being a booker.
And how did he become that for you guys? Was that something he asked to be a part of, or is that something he just kind of fell into, or is that something you asked him to do? How did that all work out?
Well, Jim, I don't know about with ECW. What I do know with TWA, he was in the right place at the right time. He always wanted to be a booker. I do believe that. The booker is responsible for putting together the angles that you grow from the inside, and you got to know the talent, and you have to have the respect of the boys. I mean, that's the bottom line. And the local guys respected Larry. And what I found out, obviously, was the national guys respected him as well. And my philosophy, which was, Larry and I would talk before the show, and Larry, of course, ran the dressing room and ran the show and ran angles that worked. The one thing I remember about Larry is when we sat down in the meetings before time to kind of come up with the card, I had my feel for what I wanted. He was able to put my feel into actions. We did some crazy matches. Most of them, I don't know if I want to take credit, but I will. Most of those angles I put together. And Larry just was the one who made the mechanics work. So just for me, Larry was in the right place at the right time, wanted to be a booker, worked for me, and the rest is history.
Was there ever an idea he came to you with, or Jim, that you overheard, where you kind of had to say, no, we're not going to do that. That's too far out of my realm of comfort, or what we can do, or it's too dangerous, or whatever?
Jim, you want to take that one?
No, I was never involved in any kind of meetings or anything like that. I was green as goose shit. So I wasn't invited to stuff like that yet.
Well, that's a new one for me. Green as goose shit. There you go. That's the new name of this podcast.
Green as goose shit.
For me, the answer is no. He knew me, and he knew what I was trying to achieve. And he never came to me with an angle that he knew I wouldn't agree with. And to be honest, he also did some angles he didn't come to me with. He just did it. Okay.
Was there ever an issue with that?
No. Are you kidding? In fact, the one surprise, I'll go back. There was one match that we had at the Philadelphia Civic Center, Pennsylvania Hall. And the match was the Blackhearts, which was out of Florida with Luna Vachon, the Blackhearts against the Dog Pound, which was DC Drake and Johnny Hotbody. And they did a match. In fact, you can Google that match. That match was violent. I'll just leave it at that. Violent. And it was more action outside the ring than inside the ring. And the Blackhearts won the belt. And when the Blackhearts won the belt, nobody in that building thought that the Blackhearts, including me, I was not aware of the angle.
But didn't you have to fly them in?
Yeah.
For the next show?
Yeah, well, there was 3 flights because Luna had to have her own room. Okay, was her husband, so that took care of one room. And then it was so I had 2 hotel rooms, 3 air flights, and the Black Hearts were by nothing, not they were not national in the sense that they were a name,
Right.
but when the Black Hearts wrestled the Dog Pound and the Dog Pound lost, the whole place popped. And when they left, that started the angle to break up the Dog Pound. Well, when they left the ring, they left the ring with the belts. Nobody, like I said, I wasn't even aware of it.
Wow.
Damn, I'm the promoter. I wasn't even aware of that. And it worked. And it's funny. The one thing you learn about wrestling is you're only as good as the people in the ring with. So in this sense, when they were in with the Blackhearts and the Blackhearts were starting to they looked the part of wrestlers. Okay. The one
The
problem,
gimmick was over.
yeah. Oh my God, it worked. It was so over, it was ridiculous. And Luna was over with us. I mean, it all worked. Again, expense wise, one of the comments I always make is I overspent. I mean, that was clear. Here was a match that was a middle match of the card. I don't think anybody bought a ticket to see this match. And that oh my God, it went over so big time. But that was an example. Larry knew what I was looking for. And that really took the local guys up a notch. And he ran the angle without even, I swear, I did not know it. I can't take credit for it.
A note on that match: the Dog Pound was managed by Donnie Allen.
Yeah.
And I think Donnie will admit that he probably suffered 3 concussions that night from Luna. She beat the living hell out of him.
Wow.
He might still be going to a chiropractor for it.
Donnie's an example. Donnie was small, and for us, he couldn't. He could wrestle. The kid could really wrestle.
Yeah.
And Donnie's still in the area, and hopefully Donnie's listening to the show because I'd love to give a shout out to him. And Donnie wrestled with the Dog Pound, as did Woman. Now, Woman never wrestled, but she managed them. And the Dog Pound got notoriety because of their affiliation with Woman. Donnie got his ass kicked. He was so small that if you hit him and he flew, the bump was effective. And to Donnie's credit, he did some phenomenal bumps. But yeah, that's an example of homegrown talent. Donnie would never make it on the big stage because he's too small. Okay, but what you learn about the locals, and Jim might actually answer to this even more. Most of the local independent wrestlers don't have the size. The reason they stay local is they're never going to make it on TV. But again, all the big guys at some point started at locals. So you have to get through the talent. They have to figure out their role. And once they come to the conclusion that they're not going to be a huge WWF superstar, once they get to that, they realize one of the local wrestlers today has nothing to do with Larry Winters, nothing to do with TWA, Chris Wilde, Breaker Morant. There's some local talent Chris Wilde and Breaker Morant to me was the new DC Drake, Larry Winters. Those guys put on a show. I've watched them in action. I managed both of them at some point. I watched these guys in action, and I watch it close up, and they scare me to death.
Now, one of the things you pointed out was that Larry Winters always wanted to be a booker, and there's actually been some discourse about this recently. So, Jim, I had a question for you. If you think there actually is a difference, but can you explain the difference between a matchmaker and a booker?
Wow. If you're using 2 different people, if you say person A is a matchmaker, he's the one who says, I want to see wrestler 1 versus wrestler 2, wrestler 3 versus wrestler 5, however you want to call it. The booker, I think, would be the one to say, okay, here's where I polish the match. I polish it up and make it pretty, and this is how we're going to finish it. Where maybe a matchmaker doesn't really care about the the finish or where the angle's going. That's where the booker comes in with more storytelling than matchmaking. I don't know if Joel agrees with that, or maybe I'm opposite. Maybe it's the opposite way around.
Now for me, to be honest with you, the matchmaker is the promoter. Okay, and the booker is the one who puts the matchmakers. Well, I'll give you an example. When I booked Jerry Lawler against Curry Von Erich at Temple University, that was my match. I'm the one that I decided to pay for those guys, and I created the match. Jerry Lawler came to me at the time and said, "How about if I throw fire for the finish?" And I said, "Let's do it." So Larry didn't even get involved in that match at all, but I was the matchmaker. I was the promoter. Jerry Lawler actually booked the details of that particular match. So one of the things I did do on the major guys and the national guys is a lot of times I brought the guys in and they had to wrestle because there's this storyline going on. Again, with Curry Von Erich and Jerry Lawler, they wrestled the Sportatorium 100 times. They were running angles. They ran. They couldn't do something. I couldn't have a belt change, for example, without their approval. So I think the matchmaker is more the promoter, and the booker is the guy that actually figures out the details.
So when he initially came in, you mentioned you started off the feud with him and DC Drake. Was that based on what you had seen in that other company, the NWF, or was this something totally new that you wanted to start from scratch with?
No, it was a continuation. I didn't start that angle at all. Okay, that angle was around on the East Coast way before me. What I decided was that was going to be a central force for the TWA. So I was, if you want to hindsight, if I was smart enough to figure out that these guys were money. And from a promoter standpoint, by my having DC and Larry on the card, that was one match. Typically a wrestling card is 6 or 7 matches long, depending upon how much the promoter wants to spend. Well, if one of the matches DC and Larry, that's 1/6, 1/7 of your entire show. And then you run the angles. And again, clearly we got Tony Stetson involved. We got Johnny Hotbody involved. That's how we created the Dog Pound. That was a central piece of what TWA was put on the map because of those guys, to be fairly honest. And I do talk to DC Drake still. In fact, I'm going to be seeing DC on the 28th or 29th of this month. He's being entered into the New England Wrestling Hall of Fame. And I am actually getting driven up there in Warwick, Rhode Island to see DC get inducted.
Oh, that's a drive. That is a hell of a drive.
It's a 4.5 hour from
wow. Well, congratulations to him. Well deserved.
Oh, yeah, well deserved. But my point is, there he is in New England getting elected to the board, and he's not on the board or not going to New England Hall of Fame because of me. That was done way for me.
I'm looking off to the side here because I've suspected that I've had raccoons in my backyard for the longest time, and I just saw 4 of them ganging up on something in my backyard. So if you notice me looking over here, I'm looking. No, I don't think so. If you notice me looking over here, I'm watching my camera on my backyard. But anyway, so Larry Winters and Johnny Hotbody were the first TWA Tag Team Champions, winning the titles on May 18th, 1991, defeating Jimmy Jannetty and Rockin' Rebel. What was the decision to put the belts on those two, or was that Larry's decision?
It was Larry and mine. When we had the conversation before time, the kicker right there was Rockin' Rebel, and this goes back. There's more history there than just in the TWA. But Rebel was a guy that never learned how to sell. Abdul the Butcher, I have video. God knows,
I know exactly where you're going.
The Butcher beat the living hell out of him, and every time he beat the shit out of Rockin' Rebel, Rebel would get up, and he kept telling Rebel, "Stay down." Rebel doesn't stay down, so Abdullah would just nail him. Well, anyway, he was getting to the point where he had to be taught a lesson. And the one thing that, to Rebel's credit, and obviously he's passed, but to Rebel's credit, he learned, because one of the things that we made him. Rebel sold more tickets for the TWA at the Civic Center than any other wrestler, because I used to pay the guys who wrestled. If they sold tickets, I gave them a piece of each ticket revenue, so they made some extra money. And Rebel, to his credit, sold 50 or 60 tickets, and we had him lose on the card. Well, that's tough to do, especially when you're doing a local promotion. If somebody sells 50 or 60 tickets, you'd think you'd put them over. Well, Rebel, if you recall, was the first TWA champ. And then he lost the belt. We took the belt away from him. Okay, so, I mean, Rebel, we had to teach him a lesson, and that was part of it. So then that was a conversation that Larry and I had.
So when along this whole time, Larry's kind of instrumental in more than one way for TWA, right? He's not only booking the shows or helping you book the shows, but he's also, you mentioned, running your wrestling school. Now, how did that all come about? The idea of it, determining who would be in charge of it, and all that stuff.
Well, believe it or not, I remember us having a conversation, and I don't remember what show it was at. We were having a conversation, and I had a concept. And again, whether it's doable or not doable, we could debate that. But I had a concept that if we had a wrestling school, that if we did enough shows locally, I could guarantee that if you pay the tuition to come into the school and you get through the school, that we would use you on our cards and you would get paid and you would make back the money that you paid into the school. Well, that's, it's an ingenious idea. Well, keep a Monster Factory did that years before us. Okay. And so here I was in Philly. Monster Factory was over in Paulsboro, New Jersey, and those guys did a hell of a job. But we thought, why not put together a wrestling school? So that was a combination of me. It was Ron Shaw, Larry Winters, and myself. We decided to open up a wrestling school. We found this gym on Frankfurt Avenue in Philadelphia. And that's another story. And I'll never forget, Jim. You may not have heard this story. If you obviously were at the school. We were in the back of a gym, and I wanted to dress up the school, and I wanted to put up mirrors around the school so it would at least look like a dressed up wrestling school. Well, the cost of the mirrors that I wanted to put up, Larry and Ron had to agree to it because they were basically 2/3 of the wrestling school. The school was set up third. Okay. And anyway, I have a document that shows that we were partners, and I wanted to put up the mirrors was, if I remember correctly, $1,100. And my two partners refused to put up their share. And of course, I was always going to get my way, so I agreed to put up the mirrors by myself. And they made me put it up by myself. But anyway, so getting back to it, we just decided to put together a school, and then I used the radio show talking about, and we came up with the name of Ringmasters Wrestling School, and I have no clue who came up with that name. And one thing led to the other.
Now, Jim, when you got involved with Ringmasters, was Larry instrumental in your training, or was he kind of just a figurehead over there?
No, he was instrumental in the training. He wasn't there all the time. I think I went, I'm not sure how many nights a week it was open, but I would go on Tuesdays and Thursdays. They were just the days that were accessible for me. And he wasn't there all the time. And I think once I was comfortable with being a referee and reffing in training sessions, I don't think John was there all the time either. I might be wrong. It's been so long. But those two were the ones that were instrumental in my training.
So when you would go to training, what was the the training regimen for a referee? Because I think that's changed over time.
Well, I would think it has because refereeing has changed over time. The first night I got in the ring, I was backed into the corner by Johnny Hotbody. My shirt was pulled over my head, and I had the living shit chopped out of my chest.
Yeah, that was my first night in wrestling training too. So not everything has changed.
But no, John would, would get in and get involved with the training and kind of, as the guys are doing their stuff, like they're doing segments of matches and things like that, not necessarily the drills. But when they get into the part where they're training with segments of their matches, John would get in and say, okay, here's where you kind of want to be, and here's what you want to pay attention to with this or that happening, and here's where you want to count. You want, your counts want to be steady and the real basics of refereeing. And then I would get in and take my turn. And as I was doing my thing in the ring, he would fix it. No, you're too far to the left, or you should be on the other side. Remember, TV camera's going to be there, so you want to work in this direction, and things like that. And we talked about this in the first show we did. It was 8 weeks of training for me. Not that refereeing is easy, but I knock wood, I picked it up pretty easily, pretty quickly, and was doing shows within 8 weeks.
Yeah,
So
and think about
go ahead,
Ryan.
Joel.
Yes, think about this one. To learn how to be a referee is as integral a part of the wrestling show as the wrestlers. Okay, I was always the contention the ring announcer gave you some credibility. The referees gave you credibility. I mean, you talk about refereeing. I've said this before. Tommy Young was, to me, the persona of what a referee should do, and
Absolutely.
Tommy was involved in every match, and he knew exactly where to be. He knew where. It was amazing. But if you're going to learn how to be a referee, and in the school is a Larry Winters. Now, DC Drake very rarely came to the school because he lived up in Connecticut. But Larry Winters, Ron Shaw, J.T. Smith, Sandman. I mean, and these are guys that started with but having these guys, Johnny Hotbody, Tony Stetson, coming to the school, and these guys are class athletes. They are wrestlers. They're local, but they were phenomenal. And then you have somebody like a Jim Molyneux learning how to be a referee with those guys in the ring. Oh my God, that means the referees. And look, Jim Molyneux lasted the entire ECW. He's doing autographs. People want to give him $10 to sign an autograph.
I wish.
Okay, well, so I see on Facebook he's going to be in Hamburg, wherever the hell he's going to be. He's a persona. Okay, people wanted to. This is it. We were very fortunate. If you take the referees at TWA, you take Jim Molyneux, you take John Finnegan, you take Joe Zanoli. I mean, God Almighty, we had great. Like I said, it just all came together. And we had some super talent, and Jim Molyneux in his own right is a talent. Okay. It's important that we all understand that the referees are one of 3 people or one of 5 people in the ring that make a story work.
And first of all, I want to thank you for all those kind words, but not only,
I'll send you a bill in the morning.
thank you. I'm sure you will. Not only do you have to worry about the match, but there are other things. You're the last line of security. If someone's not happy with what's going on in the match and they try to get in the ring, they're, especially on the independents nowadays, there may not be a security system or a security guards there. The referee's the last one to stop the guy from getting to whoever. And there were probably times in TWA where there may have been an issue with some of the fans, because this was when fans still believed or wanted to believe, where it could have been very easily someone try to get into the ring at someone. So there's that aspect of the matches too. You have to be an extra set of eyes for not only the match itself, because if something's going, here's an example, if something's going on in the crowd, you want to let the guys know because they're not paying attention to it, and they might want to say, okay, let's go to a hold and wait until the crowd comes back to pay attention to us, or let's give them something to pay attention to, depending on their mindset. So you have to be another set of eyes for different things like that.
And I can tell you, as a promoter, you might not always notice a good referee, but I promise you, you will notice a bad one. And I've made that mistake in the past. Uh, so what was what
I'm
was
just
your
I'm going through people's names in my
in your
head.
head? Don't name names. Joel, so what was the initial goal? Did you guys have a goal when you first set up this school? Was it, hey, let's do this, we can make money, let's do this, we can create our own stars? What was the idea behind the school, or did it just seem like a fun project at the time?
Well, I'll tell you, it was a combination of things. First of all, for Larry Winters, it was to make money. God bless Larry. Larry didn't do anything for free. He did it to make money. And to his credit, he looked at the potential of if a student signed up for, I think the tuition was 2,200. Don't hold me to that number. The 2,200, think about that. 750 of it, 730 of it was Larry, and 730 was Rod. And when we first started out, we were taking the profits out of the school. But anyway, so for Larry, it was the money. For Ron Shaw, it was the money. For me, I was looking at it. Yeah, look, I'm not going to say the money wasn't an object, but for me, I thought if we could homegrown talent, it's going to be cheaper for me to put on a show. And the reality is, and again, this is something I've said this for years. Guys like the Monster Factory did a better job of this than I did. They would run shows where of the 7 matches, 6 were homegrown at the Monster Factory. And then they would always have 1 or 2 names on the card that would draw. With TWA, we did it, obviously the complete opposite. We have a ton of national names come in, and we had enough local guys. I mean, we had enough local guys. That was the premise. If we could homegrow the talent, and sure enough, at our Ringmasters Wrestling School, Paul Orndorff had a visit one time. Buddy Landell came to the school a couple of times to do some teaching and do some lessons. It was a way of us getting on the map. And to be honest with you, having homegrown talent, I don't know that we taught anybody better than Monster Factory. Monster Factory's still around, and we're not. So they obviously did a good job, And I've said that all along, but it was basically building up homegrown talent. That was the premise.
Joel, I don't know if you remember this or not. Before I came to Ringmasters, you took me to the Monster Factory. And I can't remember if there were other people that went too, but we went there that night, and at the time they were in an old pizza shop. and we got there and no one was there. If people were there, I probably would have signed up with the Monster Factory because it was a lot closer to my home. But I stuck around, and the Ringmaster started, and off I went.
Yeah, it's funny. I do not remember that. Wouldn't surprise me, because it was interesting. I held Monster Factory in high regard. Bam Bam Bigelow came out of that school. They were there way before me, that's for sure. And again, Paulsboro was kind of a haul for me, but again, I was hoping maybe to have you hook up. That was whatever, but when we created Ringmasters, and this is always one of those, you can rewrite the history. If we knew what the hell we were doing, we'd still be doing it. All right. So we obviously did something right. We just didn't do enough of it to make it really work. But look, Jim Molyneux's around, and there's a reason for it.
So after TWA closed, Larry worked a number of dates for ECW. He'd eventually win the ECW tag titles alongside Tony Stetson, another TWA name. Why do you think his time to in ECW came to a close, Jim?
Well, honestly, it's because of Eddie Gilbert. And just my personal opinion, when it was time, when TV came along and Todd decided he needed someone with more television experience than Larry had, brought in Eddie Gilbert to be the booker, and Eddie brought in a lot of his people, a lot of people he trusted, which a lot of people do or did back in the day. If you were a booker and brought into a territory, you'd have a couple of guys that you would trust and wouldn't run off with the belt or go into business for themselves or whatever. And I think that he was a victim of that. Not that it should have happened, because Larry's still a talent, and I think he could have stuck around. He may have been bitter and left, but I don't know what Eddie had in mind for him in the way of storylines.
Afterwards, after ECW, he went on to work a number of independent dates, just kind of random spot shows. Most notable might have been Pro Wrestling Unplugged in 2007, 2008. He would make his TWA return under Mike Tartaglia in 2009, taking on one of his old tag partners, Jimmy Giannetti. And Joel, you were at that show. What was it like meeting up with Larry Winters? Almost 3 decades later.
Well, what was two
Two,
decades?
two. It was two then.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I'll tell you the little story here. I hate to keep telling stories, but one afternoon, I get a phone call. I hadn't, now keep in mind, after TWA went under, January 18th, 1992 was the last show. And we talked about that, I think, our last show. January 18th, 1992, up until 2009, I had not watched wrestling on television, had not gone to a wrestling card. I missed the entire ECW phenomenon, missed it completely. Okay. I get a phone call at my office. I'm in financial services, been a financial manager, believe it or not, now for 47 years. But back in 2008, 2009, I get a phone call, and my assistant answers the phone, and it's a guy by the name of Mike Tartaglia. Do I want to take the call? Hadn't spoken to him, since 92. This was 2008, 16 years, whatever it is. Anyway, I pick up the phone. It's Mike. And Mike tells me that he wants to restart the TWA. And do I have my permission to use the name TWA? Well, what am I supposed to say after 16 years? No, he can't use it. So I said, sure, you can use it. Go right ahead. He says, well, I'll tell you what, we're going to be doing a show at the Flyer Skate Zone. Why don't you come out to the show? Now, again, hadn't been to a show in all those years, and I was very resistant. I said to Mike, no, I don't want to bother coming. Anyway, I decide to go to the show. Now, I don't know how to explain this, but I was so nervous driving there. You have no idea, because wrestling is a drug. It gets in your system, and I was able to walk away from it. Pissed a lot of people off doing it, but I was able to walk away from it. And here it is, a decade and a half later. Anyway, I go into the show. Obviously, I get there early. I walk in, and the first person to meet me at the door is Larry Winters. And Larry got there. I don't know if he got there to meet me, whatever it was, but Larry meets me at the door. He gives me a huge hug. And if you know Larry, when he gave you a huge hug, you felt it. Anyway, he gives me a huge hug. He was glad to see me. He literally thanked me for my years of service, and I can't believe it. He made some money because of me, et cetera, et cetera. I then walk in, not fully expecting what I expected. And there was Tom Brandy and King Kalua, and they all give me the same. And they didn't work for me as much as Larry Winters did. They give me the high five, and it was great to see you. And then there were other people there, and it was Glenn Osborne there. It was Buddy Landell was there. And well, that's how I got to see these guys. And, they came up to me. They were kissing my ring. I mean, it's the best way to describe it. They were thanking me for the business, et cetera, et cetera. And then Mike, of course, got me involved in an angle in the ring, which I had no desire to get involved in. I got involved in that. Then he asked me to do some ring announcing, and one thing led to the other. But that's how I got to see Larry after, again, hadn't spoken to Larry in 16 years.
That's the first show I met you at, and I went up, introduced myself, said it was great to meet you, and you looked at me and you said, "You don't know who I am."
Well, it's funny. And Jim, if you had the same, I was always, I mean, when I did the ring announcing for the TWA, I did it because it was a passion. I enjoyed doing it. Whether I was a good ring announcer or not, I think it was okay. But you suddenly become somewhat of a persona, okay? And when people come up to you and they thank you, it's sincere. I'm sure, Ryan, when you came up to me, it was sincere, but you didn't know who the hell I was.
I do.
Well, the,
I
well,
did,
the,
and I do.
yeah, well, here's what you find out is you suddenly realize you are a persona, okay? And people were very sincere about it. So I got a kick out of it, okay? And again, it goes back to Jim Molyneux is known in the wrestling with the hardcore wrestling fans. Jim Molyneux is a persona. Okay, now unfortunately, Jim not wrestled, but refereed under his own name. Okay, so everybody knew Joel Goodhart as Joel Goodhart. Everybody knew Jim Molyneux as Jim Molyneux. Larry Winters was a wrestling persona. His real name was John. Okay, so you have to learn how to separate the two, and a lot of wrestlers have never learned how to separate the two. I still go to these wrestling cards where the heels are all selling merchandise, and I just don't understand. I still don't understand how they do. Anyway, I'm getting off topic.
Well, Larry unfortunately passed away in January of 2015. Mike Tartaglia actually inducted him into the ECWA Hall of Fame, despite Larry never working for ECWA. It just that was somebody who meant a lot to Mike, so he did that for him. What do you guys think his legacy for pro wrestling in pro wrestling will be?
Well, I think here we're doing it. We're talking about him years after he passed. Now, I was fortunate enough to go to his funeral, and I actually sat at the funeral. It was Larry Sharp was there, Davey O'Hannon. I sat with Davey O'Hannon. He was there. Larry, the fact that we're talking about an independent wrestler years after he died, talking about matches that were 25 years ago, that's his legacy.
What about you, Jim?
Yeah, and you know, I can't say any more than he helped give me my start. He helped me make me what I'm known for in the ring, along with Joel and along with John Fink and Joel for giving me the opportunity, and John and Larry for showing me in the ring. And it's something that I can never pay back or thank enough. And unfortunately, I never had the opportunity before it was too late to thank him for all he did for me.
Well, Larry was definitely a big part of the independent scene in the late 80s and early 90s. He helped shape the TWA and even the early ECW. So it was great being able to talk about him on this episode. Before we get out of here, is there anything else you guys want to share or add before we close out of here?
I have a story.
Yeah,
Joel probably knows this one, and this is Larry. Larry loved the business, but he also loved saving a buck. There was one weekend that he worked. I don't think it was for you, Joel. I think it was for Rob Russin when he ran a couple shows in the area.
Okay.
And so it was Friday night and Saturday, maybe a Sunday afternoon show too. And Friday night he broke his leg. So he goes to the hospital, they put a cast on him. works as a manager ringside Saturday night with his tag partner. Probably does the same thing Sunday afternoon. Had the overnight shift where he worked, for which we all did. We all had our own day jobs. Before he went to work, he broke the cast off of his leg.
Yes, you know this one.
went to work, found a set of stairs, and took a bump down the stairs, and goes, "Ooh, I broke my leg."
Workers' comp.
Oh, wrestling workers' comp.
Yeah, that story I remember. And in fact, Larry worked some shows of mine with the broken leg. And, Larry, instead of taking some time off to heal the leg, he figured out a way to work an angle with the broken leg so he still get his paydays. Okay. And yeah, Larry's the guy that if you ever had to take a ride with Larry, he always had $100 bill in his pocket. So when it came time to pay the tolls, they wouldn't take the $100 bill. And it's funny. I talk about Larry. I mean, I loved him for what he did for the TWA. And here, you ask Ryan what the legacy is. We've done a whole show around Larry Winters. This is years after, a decade or more since he passed, and 2 to 3 decades from when he made history in wrestling, and we're still talking about him. That's the legacy.
And I think that sums it up. I want to thank everybody for joining us here on YouTube or on your favorite podcast platform. We will see you next week with another edition of Before It Was Extreme.